nations or regional organization.
So good evening, Montana, and hello, world. This is Chris Islip from the Montana World Affairs Council. Welcome to another episode of Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. We've been in a pandemic for 8 months that has touched literally every facet of our lives. The virus has shocked economies at all levels: individual, family, state, domestic, regional, global, you name it, our economies are affected. That effect has been very deep, wide reaching, and long lasting. Now, the virus may not be forever, but are the economic effects of the virus possibly forever? Other great economic shocks like the Great Depression or World War II disrupted the norm and heralded new economic opportunities around the world. Now, looking ahead, we're asking ourselves, what looms in a post-pandemic economy? To help us understand this, we invited 3 people this week. On Tuesday evening, we had Bill Fitzgerald from First Interstate Bank looking at the Montana and domestic economies. Last night, Dr. Jonathan Westrup from the Irish Management Institute and Trinity College, Dublin, joined us to give us the European perspective. And this evening, Joanna Shelton is joining us to look at it from a global view. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this program at First Interstate Bank. We're also very thankful to the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. Now let me introduce our guest. Joanna Shelton served as Deputy Secretary General for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Trade Policy in the George H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations. She also served on the U.S. House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee staff and at the U.S. Treasury Department and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. Long affiliated with the University of Montana, Ms. Shelton teaches, lectures, and writes on economic policy issues, including a monthly column for the Missoulian. Joanna, welcome to Connect Montana. How are you?
Good to be here. Sorry for this little glitch. I was connected to a meeting taking place next week when I clicked the link. So my apologies.
No problem at all. There's not been a single show where something hasn't happened like that, but we're very happy to have you on. Joanna, I wonder if you could start by just sharing a little bit of your perspective with the audience tonight on what we might see looking ahead as changes in the global economy due to the pandemic. Over to you.
Well, thank you. This is actually a very, very timely topic, not only because we're in the midst of this recession, but this week, the 190 central bank governors and finance ministers of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank are meeting virtually for their annual meeting. And of course, the main topic of discussion for them is how to respond to the COVID pandemic and the resulting economic and social disruption. This is not only the worst economic downturn since World War II, both in the United States and the rest of the world, but it's also has been the fastest swing from healthy growth in most parts of the world to a virtual collapse in economic activity in many countries, at least in the short term. And the situation has generated the biggest ever fiscal and monetary response on the part of governments around the world. But of course, along with that comes a sharp rise in government deficits and debt. So in order to allow time for questions and answers, I thought what I would do is just begin with 3 broad points and then elaborate on them a little bit. The first broad point is that as a general matter, those countries that tackled the COVID infections fastest and most completely have fared better, not only on COVID, but also in their economies, than countries that were slower to respond or which did so in a haphazard manner. The second broad point is that the COVID pandemic and the related economic shutdowns have increased inequality, both in the United States and advanced economies, but also in lower income countries. And third, recovery from this recession is likely to be slow and subject to setbacks. So just to elaborate a little bit on the country's handling of COVID, a very large irony here is that China, where the pandemic began, has fared better economically than almost any other country on the planet. We all know they were very slow to respond initially, but once they realized the scale of the problem, the government shut down the city of Wuhan completely. And that's a city of 11 million plus people. Now, only an authoritarian government can do that, but it worked. Their economy fell about 7% in the first quarter, January to March, but it bounced back to a little over 3% growth in the second quarter, March or April to June. And they're likely to grow in 2020, making China the only country forecast to have positive growth in 2020. China's exports have rebounded and their consumer spending is up. Now, some other Asian economies have also fared better than many others, in that we have Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan. They all tackled COVID quickly, they isolated the sick, and they avoided widespread closures. Now, the East Asian economies also benefit from the fact that manufacturing is a larger share of their economies than services, and services have been hit harder by the shutdowns and are slower to recover than manufacturing. Third, on inequality, in the United States and other advanced economies, the COVID shutdowns and the layoffs will worsen trends already underway. We're going to have women, minorities, and young people hit hardest by these shutdowns. The reason for that is service industries like retail, restaurants, and hospitality have been hit hard, and they are big employers of people in these demographics. Another reason is childcare responsibilities fall more heavily on women, and with schools closed, they have a harder time getting to work. And third, the digital divide means that rural and lower income people have worse access to online education and opportunities for at-home work. Now, as to inequality in the low to middle income countries, and here think of countries in South Asia, Latin America, and Africa, the World Bank is projecting that up to 150 million more people are likely to fall into severe poverty by next year. Severe poverty, by their measure, means these people earn less than $1.90 a day. This will reverse all the progress made in the past 3 decades in reducing global poverty. And these governments in these countries, which are already, many of them, highly indebted and not able to borrow as freely, aren't as able as wealthier countries to provide generous support to their citizens. Now, third, about the slow and uneven recovery from the recession we are in now. The shutdowns around the world have caused very serious damage to businesses and workforces. These scars are deep, and some of them are going to be long lasting. And even as mandatory shutdowns ease, people are likely to be slow going back to pre-COVID behavior. I mean, going to restaurants, shops, traveling, returning to office buildings, for example. The IMF has found, as they've looked at this, that voluntary self-quarantining has as big an impact on economies today as mandatory quarantines. Now, of course, the massive fiscal and monetary support that we've seen has prevented a worse outcome, but maintaining that level of support is going to be difficult as the months go on. I mean, just witness the debate we're seeing now in Washington, D.C. about a possible second stimulus. And as Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, has said, without that level of support, our own economy may falter, and the same is true for others as well. And finally, I'd like to just say a word on global trade. The volume and value of world trade is a fairly good indicator of the health of global economies. Stronger economies tend to export and import more than weak ones. Global trade is down about 10% this year, with Asia less affected than North America and Europe. Asia's trade is down about 6%, North America and Europe are down about 20%. Now, with this COVID pandemic, the collapse in global demand has led to a collapse in commodities prices like oil, coal, copper, foodstuffs, and grain. And that means that big commodities exporters, and this includes many African countries, but others as well, are being hit very hard. Just this week, Zaire, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, announced that it may default on government bonds if there's no debt relief, and others may well follow. So as we can see, as the IMF and World Bank meets virtually, all governments have tough challenges ahead. They need to provide short to medium term support for economies and their citizens, but also figure out how to withdraw that support over the medium term so they don't prevent economies from adjusting to a new normal. We also are certainly going to see some big structural changes coming out of these COVID times. But one concern I have in particular is potential political risk that could arise if governments aren't able to help people navigate the challenges they're facing. We've seen the growth of populism in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere over the past decade or so. And that's been driven in part by rising inequality in a globalized world. So, and also a feeling too that elected officials aren't responding to the concerns. So with the increased levels of poverty and inequality that we're seeing now, if we don't pay attention to people who are hit worst, we could see a resurgence of some great political risks down the road. The bottom line, though, on all of this is that economic growth is needed to lift people out of poverty. You look at China in the 1990s and into the 2000s, perfect example where they raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into the middle class. The question is, how do you get that growth back? And of course, that is the challenge that all countries are facing now. And all of us are going to have a front row seat as this situation evolves. So thank you.
Joanna, thank you very much for that. I mean, it's a daunting task to try to give an entire global overview of the impact of this virus. But I really appreciate the way that you broke it down into those sections. Now, let me remind our participants, you are welcome to ask Joanna questions using the chat function there on the bottom of your screen. Chat in a question. I will be curating those and asking Joanna. But in the meantime, I would also ask for everybody's understanding. We started a couple minutes late, so we're going to run a couple minutes late because there's so much ground to cover. Joanna, I would like to start the questions. I'm going to go near the end of your talk just on the trade aspects, because what I'm really interested in is hearing on any crystal ball, as unfair as that may be, major structural changes to the global economy. For instance, I mean, globalized trade is something that has grown over the past several decades. And we have seen the fragility of global supply chain across the board during this pandemic, which is leading many to, supply closer to home or closer to their customers, rather than to rely on a vast and complex and widespread commodity chain network. So just looking at global trade, for instance, is this something that you would expect? Are we going to see a significant reshuffling of how we see supply chain, and trade?
Well, I think certainly that's one of the structural changes we're going to see. I think time will tell how drastically the picture changes. I think with the growing tensions between the United States and China and the pressure that our government and our president are putting on companies to get out of China and move elsewhere, I think there's been a sense that companies might try and shift their supply chains out of China. And some of that's happening. Apple, for example, the iPhone, they're moving some of that to India, and some companies are moving into other Southeast Asian countries. But I do think that this pandemic is a wake-up call for businesses themselves. And I know that a lot of boards of directors and CEOs are certainly looking at their whole supply chain now to say, how vulnerable are we? If you are reliant on one country or one company for key products, then you are very vulnerable. And I think you're going to see more redundancy. I'm not sure how much of that actually is going to shift majorly out of China. Some of it will go into Southeast Asia, but costs, of course, remain a big factor. I'll just mention other structural changes. Our Zoom session tonight is certainly one of them. This is accelerating a move to online and digital activity for work, education, and just communication. So that is going to continue and have big impact on businesses. And then I think another big impact we're already seeing, and I think it's going to be very, very slow to return to normal, is going to be global travel and tourism. So the whole airline and hospitality industry that has flourished in these globalized world with people moving around so readily, that's going to be under stress, I think, for quite some time.
Joanna, let me pick up that last one if I could. I mean, it's a very interesting effect. We're all feeling it now. And as you say, we're using it right now, this, remote interaction using Zoom and other platforms. So now shifting from trade into the labor market. I'm sitting here at home. My kids are doing a hybrid school. They're studying Spanish with their teacher here in Missoula. But what stops them from having a Spanish class from somebody in in Spain or in Mexico? I mean, and then if you look at the impact as well on telehealth, for example, where in the healthcare sector, doctors and other healthcare providers are in many ways more efficiently, certainly on a cost basis, providing some basic healthcare to people in need, using technology that's 10 years old already. So what about this, looking at the labor market? Are we going to see any kind of major shifts due to our now, maybe we've become more used to the idea of using remote technology and then using it more broadly?
I think very definitely, yes. Certainly within a country like the United States, I mean, we're already seeing the effects that you've just mentioned. The challenge that we face, if you want to broaden that, you have your kids take lessons from teachers in Spain or other cross-border services. There you get into a bigger challenge of regulations and licensing and government, the United States, for example, we have certain educational standards, and how do you assure that a teacher is going to meet those standards, or a doctor or a nurse, for example? There has been a lot of discussion internationally on trying to liberalize services and digital services, data flows, for example. You still have governments clinging somewhat to their old structures that limits that to a certain extent. But on the other hand, we've already seen a lot of that taking place already, with a lot of back office activities that are done in India or somewhere else, or help centers. How many of us get on the phone for help with our computer and you're speaking to somebody in the Philippines or India? So certainly that is going to be one. I would add though that does reinforce this notion of the pressure on inequality, because our rural areas here in Montana or around the country, if rural areas don't have access to the digital platform, and if lower income households don't have it, then they are at a disadvantage, and that is going to accentuate that disadvantage that they already face.
So, Joanna, now kind of looking at something that you mentioned earlier, you said, being careful about the new normal. All of our guests this week have mentioned the importance of the injection of money from central banks into the economy. We see it here in the state of Montana, as the state is going through its second round now of relief funding. And you mentioned that at the federal level, it's stuck in Congress, but we had a very significant first round injection to consumers, buoying spending a bit, increasing savings, interestingly. But the question is really on the new normal and being cautious. I think you said that we don't disallow the possibility that new ways and new elements of our economy emerge, as has happened in previous shocks. So, I mean, looking at the current economy, Joanna, is there anything that you see that is maybe low-hanging fruit, these so-called zombie sectors or zombie areas where the reason that they're still going on is because of massive central bank subsidy, and maybe it's time for them to move on. Do you envisage any sectors feeling that kind of shift?
I hate to be too specific on this, but I think it's a little early to say right now. In fact, I think it's too early to say right now which companies or which industries are not going to face it. However, I mean, I think one obvious, when we look around at all the airlines with excess capacity, trying to decide. I mean, United Airlines is trying to figure out whether they put their planes on long-term hold in the desert or park them in airports around the country in the hopes that some of the travel might return. You know, the administration and the Congress are discussing, should we provide relief for airlines? And they're major employers. And so the implications of that for so many individuals and families is tremendous. And yet, can we really expect that in a year or even 2 years, we are going to be back anywhere close to the level of travel that we had pre-pandemic? I think that's very doubtful. So that's a question of, how do you ease and what do you do with some of these major industries that are very important to our economy, and yet you may not be able to support them forever, certainly, and shouldn't.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thought about the emergence of new economic opportunities through shock. Now we've come to time, but I hope you all will humor us as we maybe go a little bit over time since we had a late start. Joanna, I had one last question for you, if I could, and I wanted to pick up on your point on inequality. I think a very important one, and one that Jonathan Westrup also raised last night. And I guess the question, maybe simply put, would be, in any economy, you have winners and losers. You have those who gain and those who do not.
Mhm.
If we're sitting here in Montana, why should we be worried about global inequality? What kind of effect would that actually have on our lives? In short, why should we care about that important issue?
Well, first of all, I mean, we certainly care about inequality in our own economy, in our own society. And if you look globally, the greater the stress that countries are under and their people are under, the one very clear example is if countries in Latin America, for example, Mexico and others in South America, if they are struggling as badly in a year as they are now, that puts a lot of pressure on migration and emigration. And so for folks, you know, that was one of the reasons actually for inaugurating the first NAFTA. The feeling was, you know, at that time, Mexico's population was 50% of their population was under the age of 20. And if you couldn't get their economy stimulated so that those young people had prospects for a good life and to earn good livings in Mexico, where are they going to go? They'll go to the United States. Same is true for countries in Africa, Central, Middle East, et cetera, who go to Europe for the same reason. So some of it is purely selfish, if you know, in that, but you know, we are a global commons, and we're all in this big boat together. And I think just a general concern about our fellow humans suggests that we should care how well other people are doing. And the last reason too, again, is sort of self-interest. And that is that when other countries are doing better economically, they help us generate more activity here. We have better export markets. We have education can be provided. So we benefit as well economically by other countries doing well. Just like if your neighbors are all really poor, you're not likely to do as well as if you all can kind of share the wealth and have more interchange. And the same is true globally.
I think that's a great place to kind of wrap up here, Joanna, because it is very difficult to keep in mind that it's not a zero-sum game. I win, you lose when it comes to certainly economies at all scales.
Right.
I don't know anybody who could have pulled off what you did, Joanna, looking at this kind of making sense of the impact on the global economy the way you did. I really appreciate it. It's really kind of brought out those really key points that affect us all, frankly, and the kind of look ahead that you and the other guests have given us is just it's a really rich view. So I want to go back to you, Joanne, if there's any last words you have or anything you'd like to add.
Well, not really. I think we've covered all the main things. I think just that at this point, I would just say everybody stay safe, take care of yourselves, and take care of your friends and neighbors as well, because we'll all get out of this one of these days. So best wishes to everyone.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. Let me now just thank all of the participants from tonight and from this entire week. If you missed the previous episodes with Bill Fitzgerald looking at the Montana and U.S. domestic economies, Dr. Jonathan Westrup from the European perspective, you can find them on our YouTube channel. Simply Google it and you'll come up on the YouTube channel with all of our Connect Montana shows, including this one. We'll post this as well. And so thanks a lot for your very active participation. I want to also thank once again First Interstate Bank for their special sponsorship of this series. And thanks to the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. Now, let me tell our guests as well an extraordinary opportunity next week. On Tuesday, the 20th of October at 6:30 p.m., we're going to have a 3-person expert panel on U.S.-Korea relations, looking at U.S.-Korean relations over time and currently, Asia-Pacific security and economic issues, and some very interesting cultural issues. We've got a panel of 3 experts, one person from the State Department, one person from the Korean Embassy, and another from the Korean Economic Institute joining us Tuesday, October 20th at 6:30. It's really going to be an extraordinary event. Please join us for that and please let your friends know. Once again, Joanna Shelton, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for coming on to Connect Montana. Until next Tuesday night, be well. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.